Welcome to Making Way for Berthe Weill, art dealer of the Parisian Avant-Garde, in our series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. Today, I'm honored to introduce Lynn Gumpert, the director of NYU's Gray Art Museum, formerly known as the Great Art Gallery. During her tenure, the Gray has presented over 75 exhibitions. Among them are Make Way for Berthe Weill, art dealer of the Parisian Avant-Garde in 2024, and it's still up for another few weeks. Taking Shape, Abstraction from the Arab World, that was in 2020, and The Beautiful Brain, the drawings of Santiago Ramon y Cajal in 2018. Lynn received a BA from the University of California at Berkeley and an MA in art history from the University of Michigan. The French government honored Lynn Gumpert with the distinction of Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters in 1999. After the presentation, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for inviting me here to talk about an exhibition that is currently on view at the Gray Art Museum at NYU through March 1st. So if you haven't had a chance to see it in New York, I encourage you to come. If you're not in New York and will be in Montreal or Paris, as you see on the slide, it's going to be in Montreal, in Canada, in May, starting in May, and then in Paris here. So who is Berthe Weill, or they, as the family pronounced it? She was a remarkable figure to whom I was introduced by Julie Saul, who was a colleague and an art historian. And some 10 years ago, we were out at a concert at Carnegie Hall, and I asked her what she was working on, and she mentioned that she was reading the memoir of the very first dealer to promote emerging artists, who happened to be a woman and who happened to be Jewish. So Berthe was born in 1865 and to a rather poor family in Paris, in the first arrondissement, where the Jewish quarter was. And there were 7 siblings. The father was a rag picker. The mother was a seamstress. And all the kids were sent out early to work. As a girl, she wasn't entitled to any kind of education past the age of 10. So she's essentially self-taught. This is the cover of the book that I'm showing you now, and that accompanies the show. That was produced by our colleagues at the Orangerie in Paris, and shows a portrait of Berthe by Emily Charmy, one of the artists she championed, who I'll discuss a little bit in more detail later. But as you can see, she presents a pretty stern, straightforward presence. I think what's notable about the portrait is she's dressed in all black, which was her wont. And a little touch of color is the orange or red band of the wristwatch. Now, women did not wear wristwatches in Paris at the turn of the century. The wristwatches had only been invented at the late 19th century for pilots who weren't able to take out their pocket watches to check the time and wanted to look down at their wrist. But Berthe very much saw herself as a businesswoman, a self-described terrible businesswoman, but a businesswoman none the same. And as I mentioned, she went to work when she was probably around 15 in the gallery of a colorful character named Salvatore Maier, whose gallery was on Rue Lafitte, which was the main street of the galleries in the 19th century. And if you look at number 3 on the map, that's essentially Rue Lafitte, where her gallery was. And she worked there for some 20 years. And now Salvatore Maier was described by another art dealer who will come up in the course of this talk, named Ambrose Vollard, as a colorful figure. He wore a fez and slippers, and he loved talking about art. And Berthe revered him and learned the business. The first line of her memoir, which she writes in 1933, is that Monsieur Maier has died and she's going to open her own gallery, which she does so in 1901. And despite, again, being working for the Maier Gallery, she wants to be her own boss. And she meets all the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist artists at Salvatore Maier's shop, which sold paintings and objets d'art and etchings, primarily 18th century French etchings and antiques. So she decides that she wants to focus on emerging artists. And she is the very first dealer to focus exclusively on emerging artists. So she has 4 locations for her gallery. I see that there's a typo. The gallery actually lasted up until 1940-41, when she was forced to close it due to the Nazi occupation of Paris. And you'll see that the first 16 years that she's on Rue Victor Massé, which is very close to Rue Lafitte, she only has an exhibition every few years. And then when she moves to Rue Tite-Boat, which is not too far, she includes more frequently exhibitions, 7 or 8 a year, and then ends up, when she's back on Rue Lafitte or back on this main street for the galleries, she's showing much more regularly. So the first exhibition, she meets a Catalan businessman named Pere Maniac, who is in Paris to promote emerging artists. Among them, Pablo Picasso, who had come to Paris. This was even before he came to Paris. He had a painting in the 1900 Universal Exposition, the Exposition Universelle, and he comes to check it out. But before he arrives, Pere Maniac shows Berthe 3 pastels, which she buys immediately and turns around and sells. So this is one of her claims to fame, is she's the very first artist, the very first dealer to buy any works by Picasso, who remains a lifelong friend. And it's Pere Maniac who encourages her to focus on emerging artists, which she calls les jeunes. And she creates a business card that says, Place aux jeunes, or make way for the young. And she's often running. And her memoir, again, which she wrote published in 1933, is called Pow, Right in the Eye. I'll have a slide of it at the end. And she describes her adventures of trying to make a living and to show these emerging artists. So in her first the very first exhibition, she shows a work by Meta Warwick, which you see the sculpture on your left. And remarkably, this is by an African-American sculptor who had come to Paris to study painting, but then Mies Rodin, who takes her on as a protege. And this is one of the works she makes that she shows in 1901. And in her memoir, Berthe wonders what's happened to Mademoiselle Warwick. The fact that she's a woman is also extraordinary. Almost 30% of all the artists Berthe showed were women, and she was very open to foreigners as well. On the right, this was not in the first exhibition, but in a subsequent early show, she shows this painting by Samuel Halpert, who's another American in Paris, like Meta Warwick, and who is also the husband of Edith Halpert, way before they get married. He's much older than Edith Dealer, who was the subject of an exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York. And this is an early painting of Notre Dame that was in the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art. Going back to the first exhibition, we have three artists who were represented in that show. One is Fabien Launay on the left, and he's an interesting artist. So a number of the artists go on to great acclaim that Berthe shows for the first time, which include, as I've said, Pablo Picasso. She's also the first to show Henri Matisse in a gallery. She also is the only dealer to give Modigliani a solo show during his lifetime. In this very first exhibition in her tiny shop in Montmartre, she also introduced Aristide Maillol, who go on to great fame, and says she's showing a number of his ceramic works. And again, in this mix, she also includes another Spanish artist, Paco Durio. She says we have several vitrines in which we're displaying some jewelry. Paco Durio shared a studio with Gauguin, and you can see Gauguin's influence. And in these two, belt buckle and a pendant, his influence there. So this is a shot of the top slide on your left is the entrance wall as you come in, which on the side has the three figurines by Maillol, and then also a bas-relief, a plaque that was made by Maillol that we borrowed from the Musée d'Orsay. And we also have on this wall two Launay paintings, the first two paintings on your right, including a beautiful portrait by Launay of Émilie Charmy, and then two Raoul de Martin. So in this and here in the lower gallery, you see the vitrine in which we are showing both the pieces of jewelry by Paco Durio, as well as the Meta Warwick sculpture. So the other entrance wall, of course, is a place of great honor, is a very early Matisse, who does remain a lifelong friend. He's very grateful for her early support, and later gives her some paintings. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that all the artists that do become well-known, like Matisse, like Picasso, go on to other more established galleries. Berthe keeps her word and keeps encouraging new generations of emerging artists. And she does not like the contracts, exclusive contracts that a number of her male colleagues favored. She says very frankly in her memoir, young artists need to earn whatever monies they can. And so it's fine if they show with other galleries. They will remain loyal to her nonetheless and come back for group shows later on in the 20s. Another remarkable thing about Berthe is that she produces these little catalog brochures that she publishes for each of her exhibitions. And that was our major source of information. And a shout out is also due to Marianne Lemorvan, who is an art historian based here in Paris, who did her dissertation on Berthe and wrote the only biography. She's in the process of writing a second biography that will come out in the fall. But she also amassed and did the research and found as many original documents that she could, which are the basis of the Berthe Weill archive based here in Paris. So none of this would have happened without her enormous efforts. And I'll also signal out that this was not a sole enterprise. I was one of four curators, including Marianne de Morvan and Grace in Montreal and Sophia Lois here in Paris. So Picasso, she sold these two iconic works, Moulin de la Galette on the left and the Chambre Bleue. So of course, New Yorkers know Moulin de la Galette. It was the subject of a small exhibition here at the Guggenheim in New York. And of course, another iconic image. Picasso was, as I said, very, very grateful for her. And it was Picasso, I neglected to mention, who did the portrait of her on the cover of, in the frontispiece, rather, of her memoir, Pendant l'Oeil, which you will see a little later on. And again, he remains a friend and will contribute works to other exhibitions down the line. Another of the most well-known artists in the show is Henri Matisse, that again, Berthe championed early on. She was the first dealer to include a work by Matisse in a commercial gallery. We have two really beautiful examples of his early work. On the left, the chocolate pot from 1900, and on the right, a woman reading in a violet dress from 1898. She talks again in Pau about going to visit Matisse, who was at that time living in such a small apartment that they had to open the door to the studio and put, which was, I'm pretty sure, the 6e étage, or the 7th floor, a chambre de bonne, a maid's room that sometimes artists took over, because as a struggling artist, they couldn't afford a bigger apartment. And it's been a great privilege that we had the support of our fellow museums, like the Philadelphia Museum and the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Reims, to be able to show these wonderful examples with which I think many viewers are not as familiar. So, like Matisse, a number of artists started experimenting with color. And again, another claim to fame is that she was really the first to show Matisse and his followers. At a certain point, Matisse began teaching and had a number of students who, like him, embarked on these experimentations with color. We know for sure that Louis Vaucel, who was the critic who coined the term fauve or fauvism, the wild animals, literally in French, at the Salon d'automne, the autumn salon in 1902, that he had seen a number of works by fauves, such as Delaunay and Zobel, before he had, at Berthe's gallery, her small gallery, before seeing them at the Salon d'automne, and where he wrote this review, which named this movement. So hopefully those of you in New York have seen the wonderful Orphism show at the Guggenheim, which focuses on Robert and Sonia Delaunay. A great surprise and a great joy of the show was finding these artists with whom one was not so familiar, like Béla Zobel, who's Hungarian. He was living in Paris and actively participated in the Fauve exhibitions and painted alongside Matisse and his colleagues. But we just haven't had the opportunity to see much of his work. So it was a great pleasure to again discover some of the artists who weren't so well known and to be able to borrow them from the countries. So this is a lovely painting, a small painting called Fishing Boats at Collioure by Andre Derain, another of the Fauves that Berthe championed. For the most part, we're not exactly, we can't convincingly or 100% say that the works that we've gathered for the exhibition actually were in the gallery. And we realized early on that that wasn't so important. The little catalogs that accompany the show have the title and sometimes a date. They don't have the measurements. And sometimes there are multiple paintings or paintings called still life or portrait where we're not sure what they are, or landscape. In this case, we know that he did paint a painting called Fishing Boats at Collioure, and it's the only painting that he did of this title. So we're thrilled to be able to, borrow it from MoMA to have it on view in the context of the other Fauve artists. So I mentioned early on that Emily Charmy, again, had painted the portrait that's on the cover of the book that accompanies the show. This is another wonderful portrait by Emily Charmy, which is not in the show, but is striking. She's, I think, my favorite discovery of the exhibition. Working on it, she's a very strong artist who was very active. She was of a reserved personality, Berthe writes, and she preferred to keep on her own. She painted herself nude. She painted herself pregnant. She was fearless, and a number of works she kept private. We're going to have a lecture on Emily Charmy later at the Great Art Museum if you're in New York, and check out our website for that lecture by an art historian who has just written a book on 3 women artists, including Emily Charmy and Suzanne Valadon, and a third artist, Marie Vassiliev, who Berthe did not show. 2 more works by Emily, a self-portrait on the left and a landscape on the right. And, it's always fun to see these works on the screen or in books, but in the presence, you really get a sense of a very, very strong personality who, again, as I said earlier, is a little fearless in terms of how she tackles the work that she makes. So going chronologically somewhat, Berthe begins to show the Cubists, artists who were dabbling in Cubism, who were following the lead of Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. Now, by this time, both Braque and Picasso have moved on to other galleries, but she continues to show artists, again, who were experimenting with this new way of seeing in the late 1909s and 1910, 11, 12. So this is a wall, a display of 4 works in this Cubist section in the exhibition. From the left, very early Leger, that is a study for a painting that Berthe showed, a work by Alice Halicka that I'll come back to, a work by Andre Lotte, and then a Diego Rivera work. So again, another claim to fame. Diego Rivera had his first solo exhibition in Paris at Galerie B. Now she called her Galerie B her first initial. They, as she didn't advertised that she was a woman. She knew that that would put some people off. But she is, again, very open to the number of foreigners who had flocked to Paris in the early part of the 20th century. And Diego Rivera's first solo show is successful. She writes again in Pow, in her memoir, about how Picasso and Rivera started out a little bit as friends, but the two big egos started to come a little bit into conflict. And she's very, very funny about how she describes and these interactions between the artists, her impressions of them. She is very frank. As I said earlier, she did not receive a formal education. And so she writes as she speaks. It's filled with slang. It was translated beautifully by William Rodamore. And I encourage you to read it. A close-up of Alice Halicka, a Polish artist, again, a woman who was married to another Polish artist, Louis Marcoussis, whose name sounds more French than Polish. She was a very competent, good painter. We see this work from still life from Bordeaux, with violin, obviously looking to Picasso and Braque. And then the very first and the only exhibition, that solo exhibition that Modigliani received during his lifetime. Berthe again writes how that she's really impressed by the person Modigliani, but is dismayed to see that he's a bit of a louche. He drinks too much. She goes ahead and presents this first exhibition. And here is a cover of the catalog for the exhibition, which unfortunately is closed down on opening night. If anybody has heard of Berthe Weill in advance, it's scholars in Modigliani, because they know that this show caused a stir, sorry. She had her small shop and the small gallery in Montmartre. A number of people had gathered and were looking at the exhibition from the windows of the gallery. There were 4 nudes. There's red arrows indicating the nudes. And the police commissioner's office is across the street. He passes by. He comes in. He's shocked because, as he says, you could see individual depictions of pubic hair. He says the show is obscene and shuts it down, which is, so it's closed at opening night. So there are very few sales, if any. We are still trying to figure out exactly how many works he might have sold, but the show it's just shut down. It's shuttered after its opening night. And unfortunately, Modigliani dies 2 years later. His work is subsequently championed by Paul Guillaume, another dealer who continues to promote the work. And there was a wonderful show of Modigliani and his relationship with Paul Guillaume at the Orangerie about 1.5 years ago that explores that relationship. Here's one of the nudes that was very likely shown. And then also a painting called Alice, which is listed in the catalog as well. For my study and my research on again, aided largely and done in conjunction with Marianne Lemervant, we were both so pleasantly surprised by the fact that Berthe concentrated and devoted much of her energies to showing women artists. And one of the women artists that she shows is Suzanne Valadon, who most people or most realize had also been an artist model. So we have a portrait of the famille, her family, with her son, Utrillo, her mother, and her husband, Andre Uter, on the left. And then a very charming drawing, a very early drawing from 1895 that actually Berthe dedicates in the lower right-hand corner to Berthe. And she gives to her an appreciation for her giving several regular shows of Suzanne Valadon's paintings. And they again become friends, and Berthe continues to champion her, also continues to show works by Emily Charmy and a number of other women artists. To give a sense of the period and, you know, the ambiance of Montmartre. This is a photograph of Suzanne Valadon's birthday party, a party held in honor of her. I think it was birthday, but maybe I'm mistaken. She's in the center with her mouth open. And then on the far right, you see this diminutive figure of Berthe holding a cigarette in her hand. So Berthe, we know the family, or that Berthe herself, pronounced her name Weill. It can be pronounced Veil, or Veil in French, because it was Dufy who nicknamed her La Petite Merveille, which is a wordplay. The little mother wonder is a little translation. They were so grateful for her stepping in and taking up their cause and giving them shows. And she would continue to alternate her exhibitions and still sell antiques, other paintings, drawings, original illustrations. It was Madame Maillère, the widow of Salvatore Maillère, the first shop where Berthe learned the ropes of becoming an art dealer, who encouraged her. She said, never stop selling antiques or illustrations. That's your bread and butter. That's going to allow you to make the rent. And so this is a constant in Berthe's career, although, again, as we saw earlier, she begins to show more regularly. Another wonderful work by Suzanne Valadon, who is the subject of a major show in Paris. I'm in Paris at the moment, and saw the exhibition. It's a version of one that had been shown earlier at the Pompidou Metz, and it's here in Pompidou, Paris, and it really allows you to see this singular figure who develops her own style, and who plays an important role in early 20th century French modernism. Again, on the subject of women, it's Hermine David, a woman artist on the right, we have a painting by her in the exhibition, as well as a series of etchings. On your right is an etching of Paris Montparnasse in the 1920s. By this point, a number of artists have moved to the left bank, and where the quote-unquote School of Paris, École de Paris, begins. Hermine David is the wife of Jules Pasquin, a prominent artist who Berthe also champions. And the painting that we have here on the left that Philadelphia generously lent us is a portrait of his wife, Madame Pasquin, and gives you a sense of this return to figuration, or this elaboration on figuration, that a lot of the School of Paris artists developed in the teens and 20s. So one aspect that I wanted to emphasize also, because Berthe addressed it directly, is the anti-Semitism of late 19th century France. So Berthe writes herself about how the affaire Dreyfus, the Dreyfus affair, the wrongful accusation that a Jewish military attaché, a colonel in the a high-ranking member of the army, has been betraying France by sending secrets to the German embassy. And she herself talks about how France was divided into two camps, and the artists followed as well. So there were the artists who were pro-Dreyfus and who believed in his innocence, and the other artist who believed he was guilty. So one of the major instigators of anti-Semitism in France was a editor by the name of Edouard Drumont, who was the chief editor of La Libre Parole, who felt that France was being destroyed by the Jews and rails against them, and it was unfortunately a bestseller at the time. And then we have these caricature, a series of Musée des Horreurs that we borrowed from the Kislak Center, which has the largest collection of materials about Dreyfus in the world. And I just felt it was important to understand how Berthe herself had to face down and stood down a mob that were protesting the fact that she was showing this pro-Dreyfus original illustrations in her shop windows. She did, as I say, sell illustrations by artists. This was the golden age of illustration in France, where you have both posters and a number of periodicals that develop. And again, to make ends meet, Berthe would also show them early. And despite being a self-described businesswoman, she keeps her enterprise going by hook or by crook. So this is the 25th anniversary of the Galerie B. They have an indication of Berthe in the middle, dressed in her somber black, a characteristic hat, looking out. And in the 20s, she begins to do a series of group exhibitions every December through mid-December through mid-January. She would put on a thematic exhibition and invite all the artists she had showed to participate. So on the left, we are assuming that we know she did a number of shows based on flowers. There were general still lifes with flowers and flowers on the balcony and so forth. So in the exhibition, we were able to borrow a beautiful painting with flowers by Marie Laurencin, Jacqueline Marval, another woman artist, in the middle, represented by this lovely still life with flowers. And then on the right, Chagall, another one of the artists she championed early on. And then this wonderful, wonderful painting that Dufy did on the occasion of her 30th anniversary exhibition. You see 1901 on the left to 31 on the right. And the title is 30 Years or La Vie en Rose. This was for an exhibition celebrating her 30th anniversary as a dealer called Joie de Vivre. And we're very fortunate, again, to be able to bring this, I think maybe for the first time, to New York. And Dufy was an artist with whom she had the largest amount of correspondence. Again, it was very difficult when we first embarked on researching Berthe because there were no archives. She managed to avoid deportation. As I said earlier, she closes her gallery in 1940, 41, and gives it over to an Aryan, a friend who was deemed an Aryan, to run it, who says there's no foot traffic at all, there's no audience. It closes down in 41. And she emerges after the war totally impoverished. I wanted to also kind of do a quick introduction as to why she is not more well known and has been written out of art history. It was a competition with Ambrose Vollard, a very prominent dealer who goes on to show many important artists, who writes a very negative article in 1916 about Isaac de Camondo, a Jewish collector originally from Turkey, who has amassed an amazing collection of Impressionist and post-Impressionist artists, who then donates them this cache of paintings along with a large cash gift to the Louvre, which had for 30 years also showed his decorative arts in the Salle Camondo. And Vollard writes, as I said, in 1916, 10 years after his death in 1911, 5 years after his death, that Isaac did not know what he's doing. And Berthe retaliates by writing a satirical pamphlet about Vollard that she self-publishes and then republishes at the beginning of her memoir. And here's a copy of the original version of Palme dans l'œil, which we translated as Pow Right in the Eye, or 30 years in the background of In the Wings of Contemporary Painting. And then it's Vollard, who in 1936 publishes his recollections of a picture dealer. And then later, a year later, it comes out in French. And what's interesting is that his response is that he does not mention Berthe at all. Very quickly summing it up so that there is some time for questions, the artists rally to Berthe, who again somehow survives the occupation, or do a benefit auction for her in 1946, which raises the equivalent of 130,000. You can see some of the names of the artists. Some more images of Berthe, very distinctive looking person. And she said she wasn't so easy to get along with. 4 other drawings by Picasso of male colleagues, Kahnweiler, the 2 Rosenbergs, and then again, this beautiful portrait of Berthe by Picasso that he did in 1920. And finishing up, a copy of Pow Right in the Eye, which is the first and only English translation of her memoir, which I edited and which came out in 2022. So that was a very fast introduction. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Lynn. This, yeah, it feels like it's just perfect located, this exhibition, at a university museum, because it feels like there should be hundreds of dissertations coming out of this exhibition. There's so many directions further research can go, and you did an incredible job, like doing this original research and putting the show together. So you can put your questions now into the chat option or in the Q&As, so we can you get to direct to Lynn a few questions. And one of the questions is whether you have any sense of how much these various works sold for, and what percentage Weill took.
Yes, actually, this is a great question, because she's very frank. And she writes, and she says, I'm writing as I speak. I'm going to tell you exactly what I sold them for. I'll tell you what my margins of profit were. I want to create this picture of what it was like to support these emerging artists at the turn of the century. So she bought the first 3 pastels by Picasso for 100 francs and turns them around and sells them for 150 francs. So she makes an immediate profit. She writes about how she, again, it was a struggle to keep her gallery going because emerging artists didn't command such high prices. And she sells one work by Brock for 100 francs and only takes a 10% commission. It takes only 10 francs. So she does enlist the prices, and she's, very frank about, her ups and downs and when works did not sell or when she had to resort to selling antiques or sell her library. There was one very virulent anti-Semitic article about Berthe that came out during the Nazi occupation in Le Page Jeune, an anti-Semitic journal, which says, oh, you can see that, they is only talking about prices, and falling into this anti-Semitic trope, whereas she felt it was just sharing information. And that was her very direct and very unflowery way she wrote. Again, not in what we very a marked contrast to Ambrose Volar's memoir.
Yeah. Do I remember right, Lynn, that she also gave most of her commission or most of, like a lot percentage of what she made in her sales, pass that on to the artists so they
Yes,
could.
that was often she would just take a very, very small commission, like the 10% commission. Sometimes more when she sold a number of works. She abhorred contracts. She, felt again that the artists needed as much money as they could because many of them were struggling. And yeah, so it was an ongoing variations on a theme, essentially.
Yeah. And as the artists gained acknowledgements, they didn't necessarily stay with her, right? And with her as a gallerist.
Yes, exactly. And that's why they often moved on to, even her most loyal fans would show with other dealers, but would be coming back to participate in her group exhibitions or, would continue to respond when asked to participate.
Yeah. And what motivated her to show so many women artists? Did she identify as some sort of feminist? Asked Sonia.
No, not at all. I think she was just well, not that we know of. I shouldn't say that so definitively. She was very private about her own life. She did not talk much about herself. She talked about the struggles she faced and the plight of her sister, who died shortly after giving birth, who had worked as a seamstress. But she also just talks about these amazing individuals who she became friends with, and a number of them were women. I think she was just incredibly open, and as a woman herself, realized if she could be a dealer, then of course, women could be artists, and she wanted to support them best she could.
Mm-hmm. Right. So Susan is asking if Berthe was only 15 years old and from a poor family with 7 siblings when she sent to work in an art gallery. How do you think she became rich enough within some 6 years or so to open her own galleries?
Well, it was more like 15 or 20 years. First of all, this is a great question also because with the help of Madame Mayer, she convinced her parents to give her her dowry, with which she could start this fledgling business. And from then on, it was pretty dicey. As I said, she would sell illustrations, she would sell antiques, she would sell occasionally paintings. Sometimes, an artist would do really well. But she managed to keep it going remarkably. So it was obviously much less expensive to open a gallery. I think she moved her gallery 4 times because, to keep rent down, or if rent went up and the area became too expensive, she would move on. So she by hook or by crook, she talks very frankly again in How about how she is almost bankrupt. It sells her collection before twice she tries to auction off her personal collection that she had kept of works that were meaningful to her. So I really encourage anybody who's intrigued to read Pow. The original French, if you want to tackle it, it's quite difficult because there's a lot of slang and a lot of names. And what William Rodimore has suggested early on when he was translating it, is we have a guide to all the names she mentions. So that they're brief biographies of some 400 individuals, writers and critics, as well as artists and whoever attended her parties. Whenever names mentioned, we have a brief bio. It's available at the Gray and also online.
Yeah.
And it's funny. She's just
Yeah.
a character.
It gives a real interesting glimpse into her world, but also into the Parisian art world of that.
Yes, definitely. You see another side that is made visible through her frankness and her directness and the fact that she was not pretentious.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Julianne is asking, could you please speak a bit about her artistic sensibility developed during her youth in Paris, especially considering her humble beginnings? That's a little bit overlapping with the question before, but
Yeah, it's such a remarkable coincidence that she does go to work in this family business. I think it was a cousin, Salvatore Mayer was a cousin on her mother's side. And apparently she was sickly as a child, and while her sister was sent to be a seamstress, she was deemed fragile, and therefore working in a gallery or a store would be less arduous and strenuous than working in a sweatshop and sewing 12 hours a day. So she meets the artists and she learns from Salvatore Mayer, and she develops it. Her mother apparently was a devotee of the theater, and whenever there was any money in the family, they would go and she would take them to see a theatrical performance, but not the visual arts. And the visual arts were not as accessible at that point. So it is remarkable that she learned to look and see and appreciate, and then realized that there, that there were all these young artists who didn't have the means and were not being picked up and shown. And I mean, there weren't any other dealers who were focusing on the young artists. So she does find this, way to make her mark by saying, I'm only showing les jeunes, and les jeunes need the support. Les jeunes, the emerging artists, need to have the venue to show their work.
right. So Deborah is asking whether there was any coordination, collaboration, competition, or any relationship between her and Jean Boucher, who opened her gallery in 1925.
We don't, not that I know of. This would be a question for Marianne Le Morvan. But from what I know of, I mean, Berthe mentions Gertrude Stein, and she mentions some of the dealers. For Gertrude Stein, she writes that she told Miss Stein and her brother, Michael, to buy Matisse, but they didn't listen to her and bought more Matisses later on when they were more expensive from another dealer. She mentions a number of dealers, but not Jean Boucher in particular.
Did you become lovers with any of her artists? Sonia?
Again, I mentioned earlier, she was very private. Not that we are aware of, and we're not sure if she was gay or not. She went to costume balls, dressed in men's clothing, but that was pretty common at the time. So we don't know much about her personal life. She never marries, that's for sure. And she's Mademoiselle Weill for her entire life. But yeah, that's, we don't have any indication. I'm not sure we'll ever know.
Yeah. So now the question is, where did she spend the years during the occupation?
So it's still a mystery. At the beginning of our research 10 years ago, we thought that she might have spent some time with Berthe, with Emily Charmy in the countryside of France. But it turns out, I think the latest research is that she was in Paris during the entire occupation and probably staying at her left bank apartment. By the time of the German occupation, she's completely destitute. She doesn't have a collection. She is living in pretty abject poverty from hand to mouth. And so, we're not sure why and how she manages to avoid deportation. As I mentioned, there was this anti-Semitic article that came out. She was well known at the time. But I think, so we don't know, we don't know.
Yeah.
And we don't have any indication yet that, again, we'll find out how or why, but it is a mystery.
Yeah. Yeah. So Samuel wants to thank you, of course, for the fascinating talk. Everybody says that. So given Berthe's desperate upbringing, did she have much positive association with the Jewish community besides Modigliani?
Yeah, this was actually one of the first articles that was published about Berthe after the war. There were there were articles published up until the 30s and reviews of her Pendant l'Oeil, some mentions in the 50s. She was well known, as I said, but the first article by Felix Mendelssohn, I think, was the fact that she did not practice Judaism, as far as we know. She was pretty secular in her approach and identified as being Jewish. She certainly had a number of Jewish artists she showed, and she was open to Jewish critics who wrote for her catalogs. I don't think she discriminated anybody. I mean, she was from what I can see and from my impression, again, an incredibly open, brave person who just appreciated talent when she saw it by whomever and whenever, and open to, again, a number of foreign artists, where others weren't so much.
Yeah, yeah. So we're gonna go a little bit over time, if that's okay with you, because as the last question, I want to ask you, um, this is a huge undertaking as a project, not only as a research project. That in itself is already gigantic, even though you made a big point of making sure that we all know that there were others also heavily involved. But this is a huge undertaking, and then to bring the art to the Grey Art Museum is another huge undertaking. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, it was a real challenge. And I must admit, I realized we needed a partner museum. The Grey Art Museum is a small university art museum that's located in the heart of New York, which is fantastic. But we didn't have the means and the wherewithal to be able to request important loans by Picasso, Matisse, Modigliani, and so forth. So I was looking for a partner museum. And I am just thrilled that Montreal agreed to, about 4 years ago, to partner with us. And they in turn got the Orangerie to agree to take the show. So it's very fitting that the show ends up at the Orangerie in Paris, which also houses the collection, as I mentioned, of Paul Guillaume, another dealer. So I think the study of dealers and the art market has only been increasing in the past few years. So it's also good timing, as it were, to come up with the show. Also, as our interest has been building over decades to identify more women artists, to also look at more women dealers.
Yes, and there's so many today unknown artists
Still, yeah.
in the exhibition, and I think one should notice also or mention that, you know, if an artist isn't known today, it doesn't mean his work didn't hold up, right? Or
Exactly. I mean, that is, you know, I think the four curators, we were all actually surprised by how strong the work looks, because we had only seen a number of these works in illustration. And we didn't know how strong Raoul de Matton would be as an artist, or that amazing portrait by Launay of Berthe Weill. I mean, sorry, of Emily Charmy, that was in one of the images I showed. So it's been really gratifying to be able to present the show. There are about 50 works in our presentation. The show is going to differ in each of the venues, which are one, we couldn't get major loans for 3 venues. It was too long a period of time. There's some 50 core paintings that will go. The show at the Gray has about 110 works. I should mention, in a lot of documents. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing it in the other 2 venues.
yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lynn. We said it before, but I should say it again. The exhibition at the Gray Art Museum will be on view until March 1st. So whoever is in New York or gets to travel.
Or make a special trip to come.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Then there's Montreal and Paris also following. But definitely I personally can only recommend buying the publication A Pau Right in the Eye, 30 Years Behind the Scenes of Modern French Painting. That's her 1933 memoir. And also the publication that that accompanies the exhibition, Berthe Weill, Art Dealer of the Parisian Avant-Garde. And I sent the link for the museum in the chat. And I don't want to close this event without thanking Lynn again for this talk, and really for everything you have done and continuing to do for New York and for the arts in general as you're preparing to retire. Lynn, I wish you well for your move to Paris and hope to continue working with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for coming. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you. Take good care, everyone. Thank
All
you.
right. Bye.
Bye.